I'm Paul Saunders. I'm the president of the Center for the National Interest. Although the report that we're talking about this morning, along with just the broader issues surrounding U.S. nuclear exports, is something I did in my prior and continuing capacity at Energy Innovation and Reform Project. My colleague Sam Thernstrom from the IRP is here. We'll try to move expeditiously through the program, and I'm really going to basically turn everything over to Dan Poneman to run. I wanted to introduce him very briefly first. I'm sure everyone knows Dan, an outstanding public servant. Of course, also a leading practitioner in the field. I don't need to list it all for everyone, but of course, recently CEO of Centrus, Deputy Secretary of Energy, along an important career at the White House, across the National Security Council, to be precise, across administrations, and then of course work as a lawyer and also at the Scowcroft Group. And here at the Center for the National Interest, I would say we especially keenly miss Brent Scowcroft, who was one of the founding board members of the center and kind of a long friend of the institution. But Dan, so grateful to you for being here today, and very much also to Dr. Huff and Ken and Steve. Thank you all. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Paul. Welcome. Good morning, everybody. This is an incredibly august gathering. I know almost all of you. I used to tell my mother sometimes I'm the only one here I don't recognize because we've got leading lights from all sectors. I could spend all day on the bios of our speakers, but I won't because there's so much content. I do want to thank and acknowledge Paul and his leadership, both at the Center for National Interest and at the Energy Innovation Reform Project. I had the opportunity to work with him on the Indo-Pacific study there a few years back, and Paul is truly a leading light in our field. And you can see why when you read this incredible report, which I reread for the second time last evening. It's really very content-rich and a lot to think about and a lot to discuss. And to lead us in that discussion, we're blessed by three great speakers. I will introduce the first because she's going first, and that is our esteemed Honorable Assistant Secretary of Nuclear Energy, Dr. Katie Huff. She was trained at the University of Chicago, where she got her PhD in physics. She actually got her PhD in nuclear engineering at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is a ball of fire, and the fact that Paul was, I think, probably compelled to write this report about how the U.S. has frankly lost its way and lost its leadership is exactly why we need somebody like Katie Huff, who works day and night in every corner of the globe to try to advance U.S. interests and restore the nuclear leadership that we once commanded unchallenged, and we are now, with her leadership, striving to gain back. So, Katie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I understand I have the opportunity to give 10 whole minutes of remarks to you all. I'll try to keep it brief because I do think I have very little to say that you all don't already know, that hasn't been captured in this report, for example, or isn't sort of part of your day-to-day lives. I will try to add some clarity with regard to the Biden administration's feelings on what this leadership can and should look like internationally. But I'll agree with you. What an incredibly august group of people. We're graced by such dignitaries. I am quite humbled, actually. So thank you to the Center for National Interest and the Energy Innovation Reform Project. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to speak to you. I will say the Biden administration has taken upon itself the mission to make very clear the role of nuclear energy in our clean energy transition. We see nuclear energy as a powerful tool in that climate transition, and we've made that very clear in a number of announcements through statements by our highest level leaders and through tangible work. Globally, of course, there are a glowing cadre of nations interested in new nuclear power, interested in expanding nuclear power, and many countries that once planned to retire those reactors intend to keep them running for much longer. And the United States, with our oldest, largest fleet in the world, has an opportunity to lead in both those areas because we also have incredible designs capable of moving forward into that future. During COP28, I think this was the crown jewel of some of these public statements at the highest level. We had along with 24 other countries, a declaration to triple nuclear energy capacity by 2050. Some core elements of this declaration include working together to realize this expansion and ambitious goal, but also inviting the shareholders of international financial institutions to encourage the inclusion of nuclear energy in those energy lending policies. This tripling of nuclear energy goal is consistent with the conclusions of the Department of Energy's Advanced Nuclear Energy Liftoff Report, which is, of course, associated with the pathways that we see to commercialization of advanced nuclear power. Of course, in the United States, almost 50% of our clean energy comes from nuclear energy. It is therefore the largest single source of carbon-free, emissions-free energy in the US today. And I will just say that this ambition to triple nuclear energy, it may seem laughably ambitious, but it is not a prediction of what is likely. It is not an assessment of what can easily happen based on the infrastructure we have today. It is a declaration of what is absolutely necessary, unequivocally required, at minimum, to mitigate the worst impacts of the climate crisis and frankly survive as a species. So, a strong US nuclear fleet is pivotal to seeing it work because nuclear reactors shouldn't be built elsewhere if they're not being run and built here domestically. The United States has 93 operating reactors. That's one more than we had when I started this job. When commercially operational, Vogtle Unit 4 will be a Westinghouse AP1000 running in Georgia and will total 94 finally. Just last week in Covert, Michigan, I joined the Secretary Granholm, as well as Michigan Governor Whitmer, local leaders, and Holtec to declare that we in DOE were committed to $1.5 billion of conditional commitment from the Loan Programs Office to restart the shutdown reactor at Palisades. So that means that in less than 2 years, we'll be up to 95. This is a clear and frankly tangible reversal of what had been a devastating trend of shutdowns that were unnecessary, unwarranted, of nuclear power projects, and abandoned projects that had been happening over the course of the decade preceding this administration. It's not a coincidence. The Biden administration is using a data-driven, ambitious 21st century industrial strategy to invest in America, to invest in jobs, and to invest in a cleaner and more resilient energy system. This strategy to invest in America has given the United States valuable tools to help sustain the nuclear fleet, including that civil nuclear credit program that was set up through the bipartisan infrastructure law. That is what enabled DOE to finalize terms for up to $1.1 billion in credits to the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant that could have easily shut down. But instead, in California, they'll continue to operate. In addition to the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act provides $40 billion of loan guarantee authority from that DOE's Loan Programs Office, and $3.6 billion of credit subsidy costs, available to all technologies, including nuclear energy. And the first loan out of the gate from that program, that was the Palisades reactor. That is what will allow the restart of Palisades. The Inflation Reduction Act also offers federal clean energy tax credits and provides, $15 a megawatt hour for the production of electricity produced by nuclear plants. Separate investment tax credits of up to 30% are available to, support the stimulation of construction and operation of new nuclear plants. These kinds of tax credits are already incentivizing utilities in the United States to apply for subsequent license renewals. We're hearing more and more plans for fleet-based subsequent license renewal applications to keep all of our plants running through 2050, when we're really gonna need them to hit that 2050 goal. So what I'm saying is, these policies, not chance, or coincidence, not luck, these policies have brought formerly doomed nuclear power plants back from the brink and are driving utilities to continue operating nuclear power plants through 2050. But of course, we're also looking ahead to the next generation of nuclear energy technologies. That includes Generation 3 plus, light water, small modular reactors, microreactors, advanced sodium-cooled fast reactors, high-temperature gas reactors, molten salt reactors, heat pipe reactors, fluoride, salt-cooled, high-temperature pebble bed reactors. There are a myriad of designs. There is a variety of opportunity there, but it is going to take not only first-of-a-kind risk offset by the Department of Energy and the federal government, but also commitment from utilities and customers, from the incredibly demanding upcoming demand from AI and data centers. All of those are going to have to get together in buyers clubs to offset the risks of first-of-a-kind deployment and spread those risks across N deployments. We're supporting this in DOE, of course, through the cost-shared partnership supported by $2.5 billion in the bipartisan infrastructure law. Again, not a coincidence, but instead a policy. Further, with the investments that ARDP and the supply chain activities, the Office of Nuclear Energy continues to conduct R&D to de-risk the technologies alongside a variety of industry partners, some of which will successfully commercialize and some of which will not. So what we are looking at, too, is a recognition that in the very near term, one element of success will be seeing some projects not make it, because a few projects will and not all can. The supply chain to build out the appropriate technologies for 60 different reactor designs, they cannot be scaled up. We will see the market choose some of its favorites for certain applications. Some microreactors will succeed for the replacement of diesel generators. Some small modular reactors will succeed for the replacement of coal plants across this country. We assess that 80% of the retired coal plants across the United States are suitable for new nuclear reactors, especially small modular reactors in the hundreds of megawatt range. And we have to do it, not just here, but abroad, in order to secure sovereignty and democracy. And I know the folks here would talk a little bit more about all that, but the deployment of new nuclear technologies in the United States is necessary for us to do so abroad. And the bottom line is that our international cooperation, things like our agreement with Poland, our international cooperations with nations like, Bulgaria and Slovakia, Slovenia, Romania, etc., with Korea and Japan, we have relationships that last hundreds of years with nations that we cooperate with internationally on nuclear power. Those nations look to the United States to build those reactors here, to use our technology here, and to show what's possible, to build out the supply chains, to ensure that they have a secure partner in the deployment of those technologies. So that Invest in America plan, the maturation of these technologies through DOE support, and of course, civil nuclear cooperation between nations will support an opportunity that could be in the trillions of dollars, but also is critical to the continued survival of our species. I'm often reminded of this country song. Dan will appreciate this, I think. It goes something like, I want justice, but I'll settle for some mercy. And frankly, the Biden and Harris administration's policy with regard to the deployment of nuclear reactors, not just here, but also abroad where we're partnered in sovereignty of nations for energy security, is associated with energy and environmental justice, with the communities that we can't leave behind in the clean energy transition, with the countries that we can't leave behind with untrustworthy sources of fuel and energy. But it is also simply not merciful not to do the kind of builds that we must do here and abroad. Because generations from now, they will look back and say, what did you do to give us the mercy that we need to survive, again, as a species? So we use all kinds of tools. We have intergovernmental agreements and nuclear cooperation MOUs and research and development cooperations in international space, but it's the domestic policy that really underpins our international policy and cooperation abroad, and we're really committed to that in this administration. So thank you for the time. I'm open to questions, but I think Dan understands the schedule. I'll stick around and
Good.
listen to all.
Okay. Well, that was a incredibly rich presentation, and while folks are thinking about their questions, there aren't so many cards, so just indicate your interest, and I'll call on you. But just to get the ball rolling, I'm interested, especially in the presence of two ambassadors extraordinary and plenipotentiary from Slovakia and Bulgaria, your comments on Poland. I'm actually heading to Warsaw this evening, and I'll be joining some of your colleagues from NE at a conference about small modular reactors in that region. How should we, from a U.S. policy standpoint, think about U.S. engagement with Central Europe on things nuclear? There was, for many years, a discussion led by the Atlantic Council, where Steve Green works, the 3 Seas Initiative, about natural gas in that region and weaning off of dependence on Russia and trying to create different pathways, pipelines, and so forth. You have so many designs being promoted, right? You have, in Poland alone, they're looking at large ones and small ones. We've had robust discussions with Bulgaria and Slovakia and others. Obviously, I think your team was in Romania yesterday. When it comes to small modular, it's often said that the problem is you can't even test the business model by buying onesies and twosies. You got to buy like 10. So is there thought, for example, Katie, to having some coherent approach in which maybe, I've heard some Central Europeans mention this too, they get together and say, we're going to buy 10 of design X or something like that. And then I would be remiss if I didn't say, and what about the fuel?
Yeah, I think, the kind of business case that's going to have to underpin large-scale build-out here and the achievement of nth-of-a-kind costs and certainty with regard to timelines is the same that's going to work internationally, and I think we've seen certainly some intent of that with regard to the Synthos OPG TVA partnership to finalize the design for the GE BWRX 300 and Synthos's designs to build lots and lots and lots of BWRXs across Poland. I think is a good example of how a single entity with a couple of partners can de-risk a nth of a kind approach for their nation. We'll see how well it works, but I think it has all the makings of what we believe should work. I think this idea of partnering across nations is excellent. I think it's aligned with we have this partnership for transatlantic energy and climate cooperation, PTEC, that's a critical component of our relationships with some of the nations in the region, and had historically been somewhat, fuel, like oil and gas focused, and now has a much more clean energy and climate focus that I think is really pivotal to cooperation on nuclear. In terms of the fuel, of course, something I didn't mention is, again, in terms of industrial policy and intent, there is now our uranium strategy that we sort of put together in the initial stages of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. It is now funded by our Congress with $2.72 billion. It should allow the U.S. government under DOE in my office to support sort of buyer of last resort option that should help stand up more enrichment and conversion capability, not just for us, but also for our allies and like-minded nations across the world, and in partnership with the SOPR 05, including France, Japan, the UK, and Canada. We have this agreement that as sort of traditional suppliers of nuclear fuel, we want to ensure a clean and clear supply chain for that material, for obviously, again, not just ourselves, but everyone that we want to see building nuclear power across the world. They deserve a trusted supply.
I'd like this to see us be the first resort.
Yeah, sure.
Lots of questions. Let's start in the back here.
Ari Nader from Bloomberg.
All right.
Thanks for having me. Dr. Off, good to see you. So I wanted to ask you about that $2.7 billion you mentioned, because it's contingent on limits on Russian uranium imports. With Congress seemingly unable to get their act together, is the administration going to ban Russian imports using executive authority?
So I can't usurp the authority of the president in this meeting, so I won't make any promises, but I will say, as the secretary said recently in her testimony, we would really like to have a legislative solution that would be more durable. But of course, we recognize that we can't move forward with that $2.72 billion of spending with the revolving fund and everything. All the things we need for that fuel security must be unlocked by some enacted import restriction against Russia. So we recognize the challenge, but I can't state here what the administration's plan is.
Solid maybe.
Solid maybe.
Way in the back.
Stephen Hawley, S&P Global Commodity Insights. And Dr. Hoff, thank you for taking some time today, and thank you all for hosting the event. One industry concern that's been expressed in recent years about generating more nuclear exports is the time and complexity of the Part 810 process to review transfers of technology and personnel in overseas projects under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act. There have been concerns that that review process takes too long. In the past, the department has mentioned that foreign partners have sometimes taken a long time getting back with the information they need. But if you could quickly update us on that, is that process moving more quickly? Are there initiatives to get it to move more quickly? Where do things stand with Part 810 these days?
Yeah, so that work lies outside of my office in the NNSA office, but of course we work collaboratively with NNSA, and I think in our attempts to strive to see safe, secure, safeguardable, non-proliferation priorities embedded into our nuclear exports. It's important that we hold standards high, but I think NNSA is also recognizes the import of making sure that we move those processes quickly. There's certainly attention on it. I don't have the data on whether or not it's like moving faster now than it has in the past, but I know the intent is there to ensure that 810 enables safe, secure exports rather than the opposite.
just a real quick follow-up on that. Is this being discussed in some of the pre-app? I know it's not, if it's not your portfolio, it's not your portfolio, but within what's going on in your office, is this being discussed in pre-application discussions or anything like that? Is this coming up?
Yeah, so we certainly have an interagency engagement directly on how to prioritize the movements across countries. Through Team USA, we work together with Commerce and NRC, NE works with NNSA, et cetera, to make sure that as a whole of government, we're supporting all the movements for all the projects that matter.
Okay. Ambassador Reed.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. It was exciting. I have two questions. One is more strategic, and one is more down to earth. One is your statement about the COP28 and the tripling of the nuclear resources. We are also talking as ambassadors to LNG and more traditional carbon fuel suppliers. And when comparing data, even if we quadruple energy from nuclear, it will be just peanuts to what we need to do with other carbon-based sources. So what do you say to those more traditional sources or the companies coming from the fossil energy, saying that this is just an expensive exercise, giving too much money to unknown technologies? You partially address this in your speech, but I just want to know your in-depth PR messaging to how we can ensure more private money in R&D, which will lead us to the next generation of technologies. Now, the second down-to-earth thing, we'll come to F the word, if you will. We need redundancies in fuel. And so far, if I'm not mistaken, it's 20% of fuel which is in the US consumed, which is reliant on Russian imports. It's way more in Europe. How we can do better, and when we will be able, from your crystal ball, when we'll be able to say, well, we are not so reliant on Russian processing within the cycle, because that's really important for all of us in Europe, just to get rid of this one-dimensional dependency on the Russian part of the processing of the fuel.
So the U.S. so I'll start with the first question on fossils and the balance between all of these things. The U.S. policy, of course, is to strive toward a situation in which the use of fossils is mitigated by carbon capture and sequestration wherever it's used, or mitigated by negative carbon technologies. This takes a lot of R&D, and how do we get private dollars into that R&D, whether it's carbon capture or baseload replacement like nuclear? I think there's lots of private dollars that require reliable fuel, and reliable energy, right? And increasingly, I see real opportunities, not just in manufacturing, where, new clean products are gonna be what customers desire, not products generated with a fossil base of energy. Those manufacturers and commercial interests should have a real commercial interest in decarbonizing, for that green stamp over time, but also especially the kinds of critical infrastructure and constant 24/7 power demands that we see coming up with regard to AI and data centers. It's very expensive to own a supercomputer. It is more expensive to own a supercomputer that's not running all the time. That they hire teams of people to schedule the jobs to fill those computers up 100% of the time, and not having enough power to run that computer at 100% would be catastrophic for the business model. And so I think we see, the dollars from that incredibly lucrative tech industry driving some of the R&D in the near term, and certainly driving some of the nth of a kind buyers club, which I don't think we really need that much more R&D for most of the technologies we're talking about. We've built 52 different reactor designs, long before I was born, out in the Idaho desert, and all of those designs are captured in sort of what's coming commercially today. Your
Fuel.
second question was fuel, yeah. It'll take a few years to build up the new enrichment capacity, but with the signals from the market, I think there's now, I think we're, the dollars that are clearly coming on the street from us, from France, from the UK, from Japan, from Canada, all of our partners in the Sabro 5 and others, those dollars on the street are chum in the water for the kinds of, capital investments that are going to need to be made from private industry to back up that government-led, sort of government-guided, private sector-led expansion. But it'll take a few years to expand that capacity. We do have some inventories, not just in the United States, but across, the whole fleet. And gratefully, it's a sort of slow-moving thing. You don't need nuclear fuel tomorrow. You need it 18 months from now. It's unlike fossils, right? Where a change in price changes the price of electricity tomorrow. I think in nuclear, we do have a little bit of time, but just barely enough.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Catherine, thank you, once again, amazing. Small modular reactors were mentioned. Although Bulgaria is a small country too, when it comes to nuclear reactors, we're thinking big. So we're going to build an AP1000 reactor. And our assessment is, for the time being, that small modular reactors are not needed in the country. But the cooperation with the United States, when it comes not only to nuclear energy, but to energy in general, is a strategic issue. Because thus we are able to go beyond Kremlin's grasp. This is very important for us. And that's why we also changed the fuel for our Russian-made nuclear reactors to a Westinghouse fuel. As Rado mentioned, we hope very much that it will be Westinghouse US Western-made fuel. Let's hope that this will happen sooner rather than later. Catherine, I have a question for you related to the Black Sea Security Act, which is incorporated into the NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, enacted last December. My question is whether the Department of Energy has a particular vision or strategy about how to increase the U.S. presence, energy presence in my country and in the wider Black Sea area.
This also falls a little above my pay grade, but I think the core of that comes in that Partnership for Transatlantic Energy and Climate Cooperation, that sort of bigger framework around sort of ensuring that we're a part of those conversations and supportive of the region is sort of my interpretation of DOE's strategy. But I think more details can probably be gleaned from Dr. Light, who runs our International Affairs Office. But if anyone knows the answer, okay. I think a lot of it will happen through some of those direct engagements multilaterally through PTEC, and that's certainly my understanding.
We, wow, right on the button. Well, this was incredibly rich. I just want to drop a footnote to the initial comments. You may not have noticed, but some of us noticed the number $3.6 billion of credit subsidy. That is a huge thing because that credit subsidy is basically the loan premium that the beneficiaries of the loan program pay to get the loan. In the Recovery Act, that was available to renewable projects, but not to nuclear. 1705, but not 1703 for you specialists. So the fact that there is now that loan, the credit subsidy authority available to nuclear is a huge benefit to liberate the capital. Otherwise would not have been. Calvert Cliffs died on that altar, okay? So that was a big deal. The whole presentation, Katie, was fantastic. Questions and answers outstanding. Thank you for sharing your time on this busy morning with us, and please join me in thanking Dr. Huff.
Yeah.
So now, it's my pleasure, he was nice enough to embarrass me by a long introduction. I won't read the whole thing, but Paul Saunders
do not.
is well known to everyone here. He has had an august career in the think tank world with the Center for National Interest, which, as he noted, comes from the progeny of President Nixon. And in fact, I was thinking of President Nixon and hearing some of these remarks, including Paul's opening remarks. I'll get the exact words wrong, but the paraphrase is right. President Nixon in the book The Real War said that the problem is that the Chinese think in millennia, the Russians think in generations, and the U.S. thinks in decades. To which those of us in the private sector say, well, actually, it's more like quarterly earnings reports, but not long-term thinking. But it's the long-term thing that Paul has specialized in. He has served in government. He's a prodigious author. He served in the Bush 43 administration as senior advisor to the Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs. And he's just one of the deep thinkers, as anyone who had a chance to read this report will know. He is not going to read the report, but he is going to give us, I think, the chapeau version that will then stimulate further discussion. Paul, thank you for hosting, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dan. So the report is one of these documents of the modern age that's only available online, but we've distributed actually the title page that has the web address. This is what it looks like. Beautiful picture of a reactor actually in the Czech Republic, which there's some competition surrounding. But thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this morning. And again, thank you to Dan. I'll try to be very quick here and just hit on a few high points, I guess, as an overview of the report. I guess my general attitude in looking at U.S. nuclear policy, and this is not at all a criticism of recent administrations, I'm more kind of focused on the past here. We have sort of these multiple archaeological layers of policy that have accumulated through the nuclear age across many decades. And during this period, and especially in recent years, our needs have just changed very radically because the world has changed. And I try to highlight in the report 4 ways in which I believe the world has changed kind of most demonstrably. First of all, in geopolitics, and we touched on already a little bit this morning, the geopolitical competition, especially with Russia and China. But in this context, I would say much more so with Russia than with China today. Secondly, the technology is changing very rapidly. We've heard about all of the new designs and new ideas that are being explored. And these also kind of, in some cases, make our policy less in sync with the reality than I think it needs to be. Thirdly, our policy priorities really have changed a great deal. And, we heard from Dr. Huff, I think very much about one of the big policy priorities we have today that we didn't have in the past, dealing with the threat of climate change and reducing our emissions as a country and certainly also as a global society. But in addition to that, since February 2022, people are thinking a lot about energy security in ways that perhaps they haven't for a while. And then finally, markets have really changed very considerably. Dan referred to this sort of loss of the U.S. position in markets that we enjoyed decades ago. So in brief, I'm kind of arguing that there have been these big changes and our policy just really isn't keeping up. I point to sort of four broad areas where I think the United States could do more. And I tried to come up with a list that sounds good in addition to being useful. So innovate, accelerate, facilitate, cooperate. I think fairly clear what I'm talking about, at least in a general sense, in each of those categories. But, innovate, obviously, kind of pushing forward the technology. Yes, there are a lot of design ideas out there, and certainly I would imagine most of them won't succeed commercially. But there's still, I think, more to be done on the technology side. I would flag, I think, a particular interest of mine, although it's a little controversial, the reprocessing question, which I think is something we need to take kind of a hard look at. Accelerate. In the category of accelerate, I'm trying to get at the idea, also expressed earlier this morning. We need more nuclear reactors in America if we're going to have a foundation on which to compete more effectively internationally. So we really need to take the steps that we can take to accelerate domestically. And I'm not, I'm sure you've noticed, attempting to list every single recommendation that I make. I just want to kind of highlight one area where I have a special interest domestically. I'd like to see actually more foreign investment from allied countries in America's nuclear sector. And I think there are some limitations on that, for example, around licensing of a foreign entity kind of having a license to operate a nuclear reactor in the United States. I see no reason why allied countries should not be able to be in that business, and I think that would really help the United States. Thirdly, I referred to this area, facilitate, and here I'm trying to get at policies that will help American companies to get out into the world and to compete. One thing that is I think obviously challenging, but from my perspective very worthwhile, is to try to pursue mutual recognition of licensing and standards and regulations, so that as we develop and build all of these great designs, it's much easier for American companies to build them elsewhere, and for others to build them here too. It's kind of part of the deal. But if we really want this tripling, of nuclear energy, I think we're going to have to do it much more together. And I think things like this sort of regulatory standard safety licensing piece is going to be very important. And finally, fourthly, cooperate, which I think is self-evident, working together with our allies, with our partners. One area that others have highlighted and I certainly would agree with is trying to come up with mechanisms for joint financing of some of these projects. They're expensive, they're complex, and it's a great burden for any one entity to bear. So that's kind of a very quick overview. I want to touch on just a few key issues to me, sort of in rapid fire form here. I've spoken to many people here in the past about these issues, and one of the challenges that's most intriguing to me as a policy question, I won't pretend to have a complete answer to it, is the tension that we have in our policy. We've talked about this a little bit. I've certainly talked with others about it. On one hand, as the United States, we're trying to lead the world in this competition with adversaries and rivals, and there are very serious challenges, and it's not something we can do alone. On the other hand, as a practical reality, we are commercial competitors with all of our allies at the same time, that we're competing with Rosatom or that we're competing, again, to a lesser extent with the Chinese. And we have to find a way to manage this tension. And I just find it to be a very intriguing challenge, actually. So when I'm talking about cooperating with our allies, I don't mean cooperating for the sake of cooperating. This is the Center for National Interest here. I want to cooperate to advance American interests. I want to work with our allies in ways that kind of leverage and add to the United States. Our allies, are also going to want to advance their own interests. And we're going to have to find ways to work together to do all of those things. Secondly, I guess, I certainly would point again, and we've heard already a lot about this morning, to the question of enrichment and nuclear fuel. And at the risk of sort of trivializing, the very serious and complex issues here, it's a little bit like buying a laser printer, and then every month you have to buy your toner. And what I mean by that is, it's great to sell reactors, and we make money from selling reactors. But actually selling the toner is a really good business, to be into. It's sort of all too often forgotten, I'm sure, not in an audience like this one, but I would very much highlight that. Finally, I touched briefly on reprocessing. I know that's a controversial topic, but I view it as something that's really increasingly important for the United States to look at very seriously for a whole host of reasons. I mean, first of all, we have an enormous asset that is stored all over the country in not the most sustainable way at nuclear plants. It's clear that our political system is not going to come up with a solution to take all of our used nuclear fuel and put it in Yucca Mountain or put it somewhere else. And this sort of broader question of what to do with used nuclear fuel, I think, is one of the major issues that we're going to have to overcome politically to do everything we need to do. And I certainly feel like reprocessing is an important way forward that resolves that. And again, non-proliferation concerns, absolutely, and the example we said, and all of that. But I think that the world is changing, as I said before, and this is one area where I just think we're kind of out of sync with one another. So I'll stop there. Thank you all again very much, and I look forward greatly to comments from colleagues.
Which I'm sure there will be many, but first we have in this all-star cast two brilliant commentators, and having made no plan for who's going to go first, I thought I'd just go alphabetically, if that's okay. So Ken Luongo to my right, I've known all these people for decades, but I learned something, which is he's given a TEDx talk, which is awesome. And I'm definitely going to watch it. He's authored over 100 articles. He is the president and the founder of the Partnership for Global Security. And to summarize, what's one of the wonderful things about Ken is he's not only literate, but he's numerate. And in our business, that's a very good thing. He has served as senior advisor to the Secretary of Energy for Nonproliferation Policy. He's worked on loose nukes in the former Soviet Union. He's worked on North Korea. All of the fun things that have kept people awake nights for a long, long time. And he is going to offer our first set of comments.
Thanks, Dan. My mom thinks that my TEDx talk was awesome. And she literally had no idea for 40 years what I did for a living. So it was very illuminating for her. But thanks for mentioning that. First of all, I want to thank everybody for being here. Second, I want to thank Paul for the invitation. And third, I want to say I think Paul's report is really excellent. And it's excellent for a variety of different reasons, but two of the reasons that I think are most important is its big picture and it's reflecting changes that have occurred. This archaeological layer of policy, I think, is an important concept that we have to try to work through. So what I'm going to talk about is going to build on some of the things that Paul already said. First of all, I think let's celebrate our successes. I mean, Katie went through a very long litany of successes, but I want to just summarize what I think some of the most important things are that have occurred over, let's say, the last 3 or 4 years. First, we have U.S. and allied reactor technology, which is being sought out by allies, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe. We have new technologies that are under development. We have enrichment for HALEU fuel, for which Dan has been deeply involved. And we have a lot, I mean, the numbers are boggling me. I listen to what Katie's saying and I'm like, what? These are real numbers. This is real money for a real objective. Third, bipartisan support. I mean, I have been working in this town or around this town for not as many years as Dan, but a lot. And I have never seen an issue on which there's bipartisan political support that's durable. It doesn't fall apart when there's a crisis or when there's a challenge. And I think that that's quite remarkable. The elevation of nuclear energy in the clean energy discussion, and especially what happened in Dubai, which I think was a kind of fallout from what happened in Scotland the year before, I think is tremendous. I think that was unthinkable 5 years ago. As Ted knows, we were working to try and create a foundation through the Global Nexus Initiative, and everybody else was trying to do the same thing. But now that's established. I think we should pocket those successes. And then finally, Russian aggression has really revealed energy security to be a much more important issue than we were giving it credit for before the invasion of Ukraine. That was a sobering event. So I say, let's pocket those successes and let's move on to the next level to ensure American leadership in the technology. Probably the climate people would argue with what I'm about to say, but I think that the climate argument has essentially been won, at least for the time being. But I think the work is incomplete on nuclear geopolitics and on energy security. To someone like me, who is not deeply enmeshed in the governmental system, is outside the process now, but strongly supports the success of what we're all trying to achieve, it doesn't strike me that we have the right balance between a clean energy issue and the geopolitical and energy security issue. And I think that's part of what I think we should work on going forward. Russia and China are going to be competitors of the United States in this century for a good long time. I don't see the exit ramp from competition with Russia and China. I see a continuing autobahn of competition with Russia and China. And I think we need to get used to that instead of trying to think, well, you know, if only we talk to the Russians in Vienna or we talk to the Russians in Geneva, maybe they'll convince us. No, I don't think the Russians are going to be convinced. And I don't think the Chinese are going to be convinced either. So I think we need to engage with some of the hard choices about how we're going to level the playing field for the U.S. and allied nations in this new environment. And I just want to raise 5 questions that people to ponder. Can we finance a major nuclear expansion of U.S. and allied reactor technology relying primarily on the private sector? Do we have sufficient private capital available? How efficiently and cost effectively can projects be delivered? Where are the profits? Are there adequate EPC contractors and skilled workers? Do we have sufficient supply chains? I mean, I am mightily impressed by the comments I see coming out of the Bulgarian and Czech government about cost control on large reactors. I mean, it is remarkable. It's unlike any utility in the United States. It's we want 5 for the price of 4, or we want an EPC contractor that's going to meet a schedule and also meet a price target. So I raised these 5 questions, and then I want to offer 2 examples of why I think we're not in the place that we need to be. So the IAEA organized its first nuclear energy summit 2 weeks ago, I guess, in Brussels, which followed on what happened in Dubai on the historic role of nuclear energy in climate. That was, from what I could see on social media, lots and lots of people, lots and lots of side events, lots and lots of photo ops. Looks like it was very successful, big Western presence. And then I pick up Bloomberg, and Bloomberg says that the financing for these fabulous plans, as a result, the participants were, quote, left humbled by the tepid reaction of bankers assessing the price tag of their ambition. Western bankers indicating an unwillingness to provide the $5 trillion necessary for this nuclear build-out. That strikes me as problematic. I then leapfrogged to the following week after the Brussels meeting, where I saw a reporting on the Russian-sponsored Atom Expo 2024, which is not in its first year, but in its 13th year, and had a record number of countries participating. There were 75 countries, including many from developing economy nations. I don't have any proof of it, but I read that that event averages 500 signed agreements with Russian nuclear entities every year. Now, not all of those come to fruition. A lot of them evaporate, but I'm sure some of them do not. And then I went to Bloomberg and I looked for the follow-up story on pouring rain on the financing, and I couldn't find it. So the question is, do we have a real plan for catching up with Russia and countering their nuclear market advantages? And related, have we thought through completely how we're going to prevent China from becoming another Russia? that can dominate nuclear exports. And in here, it's particularly in the non-aligned developing economy countries where they already have very deep ties through Belt and Road and other initiatives on infrastructure issues. The Biden administration and to some degree the Trump administration has done a fabulous job of booting China out of a lot of nuclear projects in Europe, in Eastern Europe and then in Central Europe and in the UK. But beyond the large reactor competition is the battle for market share for these smaller reactors. And here I am wondering whether or not we really have a well-conceived market capture strategy. Because no one is going to help us capture the market. You know, as Dan pointed out, we got lots of competitors among our friends that are only too happy to take the market. And then we have Russia and China. And then if we think international organizations are going to lean our way, I don't think that that's going to happen. IAEA has to be neutral. It's true. OECD to some degree will be leading our, but they've got other countries that they have to concern about themselves with as well. So my question is whether in capturing market share in the developing economy world in particular, whether or not the capacity building approach, which is at the center of how we're doing this now, is really adequate to the task. I don't think it is. I mean, I read everybody's metrics and there's a lot of metrics about engagement, but I'm not sure what the results are. And I think we need a new approach. I have to say, my organization has developed a very detailed and deep database that looks at where these reactors might go, and then also what the global nuclear overlay of the situation is. And I can tell you that it's clear to me that virtually every developing economy nation that may be well suited for reactor deployment faces significant headwinds in developing and deploying, not developing, but in deploying those reactors. And each of those countries has their own set or componentry of what those headwinds are. There's no cookie cutter approach, I think, that's gonna get 5 countries to buy US reactors because they all have different problems. Finally, I just say on the issue of nuclear governance, the safeguards, the security and proliferation prevention system, especially for advanced reactors and exotic fuel and cool technologies, is going to be very different than the safeguards and security that we have today. And we've barely scratched the surface on how we're going to deal with that problem. And if the United States and its allies don't write those rules, then it leaves the field open to Russia and China. And I don't think that that's where we want to be in a world where we're going to be doubling at the very least the number of deployed nuclear reactors over the rest of this century. And then the last thing I want to touch on is the ecosystem and the community of support that needs to exist to make this work. It's more than technology, it's more than finance. There's a lot of policy development, market development that needs to go on. And I think that that community needs to be built out and be durable for the long term. And I think there are pieces of that community that are missing that we should focus on. The last thing I say is we can't fail. I don't think there's any second chance after this much money and this much attention. So we need to be successful. Thank you.
And in order to be successful, we will now hear from our final speaker, who I think I've known longer than anyone in the room. We were kids at Covington and Burling a long, long time ago. We were neighbors in Fairlington, like everybody in Washington, coming to town. He's now senior of counsel at Covington. Incredible career in and out of government. We worked together in the White House. He was my lawyer at the National Security Council under President Bush 41. He worked in the Senate, worked in the House. He had, I think, 3 separate portfolios from time to time in the State Department, Assistant Secretary for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation, and many other things, and a deep thinker in his own right. So, Steve, bring us home. Steve Rademacher, I forgot that. Last name is important. Bring us home.
Dan, you're very kind, and thank you for that introduction, and thank you, Paul, for inviting me. Thanks to the co-panelists for being here. I'll speak a little bit about the report. I'm not sure I'm going to end on the most optimistic note, but hopefully I want to be optimistic. So, and on that, let me just say, Paul, I think you've written an excellent report. It really is a tour de force of the challenges facing the nuclear industry, the American nuclear industry, and I think you chart a path for addressing those problems. So I commend you for what you've done. There were two things I especially liked about the report. First is that I think at the very outset you correctly frame the issue or the problem. You talk about how basically we have sort of a 1950s era policy framework for the regulation of nuclear energy and for our engagement with the rest of the world on nuclear matters. And that would, it was a perfectly understandable, defensible policy in the 1950s based on the facts of the world as they existed in the 1950s. The world has changed a lot since then, and we basically the approach that was adopted in the Atomic Energy Act in 1954 and then built upon in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act in the 1970s assumed that America could be the gatekeeper to nuclear energy, that other countries needed to deal with us and meet our terms in order to enter the nuclear energy world. And implicit in the whole 123 agreement construct is that other countries, by threatening to withhold U.S. nuclear cooperation, we could encourage, or to be more blunt, force, compel other countries to meet our standards. And look, let's be clear, our standards were good ones. They were about safety, about non-proliferation, and things to be encouraged. But that mindset has persisted until very, very recently. And I think the most recent manifestation of it was something that I know, Dan, you worked with, and I worked with, and this was the so-called gold standard, where on top of all the legal requirements that were spelled out in the Atomic Energy Act and in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act, the U.S. government decided that as a policy matter, we would have an additional requirement, which was that anyone who wanted to do nuclear cooperation with us would have to promise to forswear enrichment and reprocessing. And I was the Assistant Secretary of State for non-proliferation. So at the time, I actually thought that was a good idea because preventing unreliable countries from going down the enrichment and reprocessing road is a pretty important objective. The use of that tool, the 123 agreement, to achieve that objective, I think the practical consequence was that most countries just decided to forego cooperation with the United States. The price we were expecting them to pay for nuclear cooperation with the United States was too high for most countries. In the end, only two countries were ever prepared to sign on to the gold standard. The UAE, they were sort of the pathfinder or the pioneer in this, and I think they had unique reasons for being willing to do it. It was after 9/11, they were an Arab country. Remember the Dubai Ports World fiasco, but they had a bunch of reasons why they needed to demonstrate confidence-building measures with the United States, and so they signed the first 123 agreement with this commitment about enrichment and reprocessing. And then we spent years trying to persuade other countries to do the same, and only one other country did, and that was Taiwan. And again, there's sort of unique reasons why Taiwan might be willing to give the United States government what it wants on an issue like that. But in all the other cases, the answer basically was no. And I'm thinking of South Korea, where their 123 agreement needed to be renewed, and it wasn't the gold standard wasn't, actually the Koreans wanted the opposite. They wanted prior consent to enrichment. And that became the focus of the negotiation. And I think with Dan as well, you were in government, that the Obama administration was in the awkward position of having to climb down from the gold standard. And the Vietnam 23 agreement basically retreated from it. But I do think this was really the 1950s mentality being applied into a new situation, which was the second thing I really liked about your report, which is how you demonstrate the declining role of the United States in the global nuclear industry. And in the 1950s, we were 2/3, 3/4 of global nuclear trade. We declined to about 10% of global nuclear trade. And the idea that in order, the countries would feel they need to meet America's demands in order to access that 10% of the global market when so many other countries have become players, I think that illustrates the fact that the 1950s construct is really, we no longer have the leverage as a nation to use the prospect of nuclear cooperation with the United States as either a carrot or a stick to persuade other countries to do precisely what we want to do. One of the corollaries of the fact that we're only 10% of the global nuclear market is that there's some pretty strong competitors out there now. Some of them friendly. We talked about that. South Korea, Japan, France. Some of them, a couple of them, much less friendly. And the less friendly ones, of course. Can you imagine the Russians saying to some country, we'll only sell you nuclear reactors if you meet our non-proliferation standards? That's not an issue in Russia's negotiations on nuclear cooperation, and likewise with China. So, if we want to promote safe nuclear energy around the world, and we want to promote the highest standards of nuclear non-proliferation, we do need to encourage countries to cooperate with us and not with countries like, most importantly, like Russia and China, where those considerations are secondary or tertiary to their desire to gain market share and also the security benefits that come with establishing a nuclear energy relationship with countries around the world. So I think for a long period of time, we sort of, as a policy matter, disabled ourselves in the competition. And you do a good job in the paper highlighting that fact and trying to reorient us toward today's world where we're one of many competitors and we have to make it more attractive and carrots rather than sticks. Just one comment about the gold standard. I think we would have been a lot more successful persuading countries to give up, promise to give up enrichment and reprocessing, if we had something to offer them, like guarantee a fuel supply, right? If you promise never to enrich, we promise to provide all the nuclear fuel you need. Why didn't we do that? Well, I'm sure there were some cost issues, but more fundamentally, we didn't have the capability to guarantee anybody's fuel supply because we got ourselves out of the business. And as Dan well knows, so if we want to do better, we need to come up with a more attractive offering to other countries. And so I was pleased to hear from Katie. All the initiatives are underway. I hope they get us to where we need to go. But I did promise or threaten to end on a somewhat skeptical note, and that is, I do think fundamentally it's going to be hard for America to be a huge player in the global market if we don't have a pretty significant domestic industry. And I think it's wonderful that in Central Europe there's interest in AP1000s and the large nuclear reactors, but is there interest in the United States in those nuclear reactors today after the experiences in South Carolina and Georgia. And I haven't heard anybody mention which U.S. utility is about to sign a contract to build an AP 1000. I'd like to know that there's some remaining interest, but I'm not aware of it, and that makes it more challenging to export to other countries because just per unit costs are going to be higher if you don't have the infrastructure, the manufacturing infrastructure, the workforce. If you're turning them out 1 and 2 at a time rather than 5 or 10 at a time, the per unit cost is just going to be higher. So the offering is going to be less competitive as compared to South Korea or Russia or China. And I think this is part of the reason there's so much enthusiasm for SMRs because there's not the unhappy track record that we have with the large reactors in recent years in the United States. And so I think America needs to redouble its commitment to the SMR concept. And again, I'll just tee up an issue that Dan can comment on much better than me. But I do think one of the fundamental problems with the SMRs is the issue of fuel and the chicken or egg proposition of nobody's going to commit to build an SMR unless they're sure they're going to be able to obtain fuel for it, and nobody's going to start making HALEU fuel unless they're sure they have a market. There's somebody who's going to buy it from them. So I think this is a perfect problem for our government to address because the market is not going to solve that problem on its own. It's going to require government intervention. It is great that the Biden administration is as committed to nuclear energy today as it is. When I started working this issue, nuclear energy was actually a much more partisan issue. There were a lot of Democrats who were kind of in the environmentalist community, which at that time was profoundly anti-nuclear. I think climate change is really it's been an earthquake in the environmental community, and I mean there's still some environmentalists who are passionately anti-nuclear, but it's reassuring to see that the Biden administration has decided that the climate priority trumps all else. So anyway, I'm going to stop there and turn it over to you, Dan, because I noticed you haven't spoken yet.
My head is exploding. I have so many questions and comments, and there's not time to do that in a lot of the audience. I'm just going to make one brief footnote to Steve's excellent presentation and then tee up the question and answer with a question to Paul. Actually, in 2004, Ernie Moniz and Artie Cantor, who we used to work with, and Deutsch and I did write an article that said we're not going to be able to basically, to your point, coerce people out of doing enrichment processing. Best thing to do is provide what we call the Assured Nuclear Fuel Service Initiative. I'll make this article available to anyone who cares to read it. I think it's still valid. I think Moniz still subscribes to it. And in addition to providing the basics of the economics of enrichment is you need 25 reactors to justify investing the $5-6 billion in the facility. It's just simple arithmetic. The only country that doesn't have it already that meets that standard actually is Korea, right? There are other issues there which you know very, very well. But the way we present it is you don't say it's the gold standard. We don't say you're kowtowing to Uncle Sam. We say we're going to do this. We're going to provide this for 10 to 15 years. And during that period, we'll have a non-compete clause. It's commercial. The other footnote is even the UAE would not have accepted the gold standard had it been pre-described as the gold standard. As I'm sure you know, they did it themselves. They voluntarily abjured it. They put it into their own law. And then some State Department spokesperson afterwards, post hoc, called it the gold standard, after which no self-respecting country could do so unless they had to knuckle under for obvious reasons. So the question, there's so much there we can go into. The question to Paul is I was intrigued by your comment about mutual recognition of licensing. I remember getting a call from Ken Brody, the head of Exim Bank, saying, should we provide support to Temelin? Westinghouse wants to do instrumentation and control, and the Austrians are complaining. So I had my guy, Steve Aoki, some of you will remember, check into it, and they said Czech is a very good regulatory authority, and so on and so on. So they measured up to spec, Exim Bank supported it, and so forth. So my question is, how does that work now? If somebody, do we have to adjudicate the quals of other countries' regulatory systems? Is it okay? I don't know how it works, even like with drugs. Is it okay if it gets approved in Slovakia and or Bulgaria and then go elsewhere? How could this mutual recognition actually work in practice?
Well, look, I mean, I think it would be a tough negotiation, no question, because these questions, particularly surrounding nuclear safety, are incredibly, sensitive questions in every society. But I find the pathway of kind of mutual recognition to be much more promising than the pathway of trying to harmonize our approaches, which I think sort of would put forward even more obstacles. So I fully recognize that would be hard, but I think that if we really want to accelerate the deployment of all of these designs, if every single thing has to be certified everywhere and nobody starts until you have, I think it's too slow, both from a competitive perspective, but certainly also from the emissions perspective. So that's why I think it's a direction to explore. In terms of how it would work, look, I think we would have to kind of take a careful look, and it has to be mutual because, obviously both sides would have to agree. I think in most cases it's not going to be too attractive to other governments that are in that industry, to accept American licenses if we don't accept theirs. I think it just requires getting kind of very close engagement and going through, the details of the licensing and the specs and how do you do this and how do you do that, and just assuring ourselves and hopefully others assuring themselves that the systems are kind of credible and acceptable substitutes for their own procedures. That's what I have in mind. That's what I have.
Thank you. Not to put you on the spot, Dr.
Wow.
Huff, but is there a U.S. policy already on this topic?
The US NRC stance has generally been that there is a real challenge if another nation just accepts an NRC license as like, this is the checkbox, because it doesn't satisfy the need to have operational oversight over the long term embedded into the capacity of the regulator of that second nation. And so this would have to be paired with some solution to that problem.
Okay, well, there's so much to go, and we have 12 minutes, so I'll ask the questions to be succinct and real questions, and then the answers as well. Sunil.
Thank you very much. Sunil Felix from the French Embassy in Washington. Thank you so much for hosting this fantastic event. Discussions are fascinating. I have one comment and two questions, very short questions. The comment is, you mentioned recycling, and I can only commend you for talking about recycling and the benefits of recycling. As you know, in France, we've adopted a closed fuel cycle policy, so which means we recycle and we reprocess our spent nuclear fuel. The reason we do that is because we strongly believe that recycling is the key to sustainability of nuclear energy. If not for recycling, I think given the fact that so many countries now want to use nuclear energy, there may not be enough uranium going around, so we have to make the best of our spent fuel, which contains so much of energy potential. So congratulations for taking the stance on reprocessing. That is the comment. The two very short questions I have. The first one is addressed to all the fantastic panelists who just spoke. At the end of the COP28, a statement was made saying that we have to triple our capacity, our nuclear capacity, by 2050. Does that include China's fleet? That's the first question. Or not? The second question, I think we all agree around this table that, sorry to be so direct, so blunt about it, we have to sideline Russia in terms of, as a nuclear exporter. So in order to be able to sideline Russia, any offer made by any Western country has to be at least as competitive, as interesting as any Russian offer, right? On the fuel side, we said that we have to secure fuel supply, and we have to make sure that we have enough fuel going around to feed the needs of any country which wants to engage in a nuclear program. We only have spoken about the front end. We have not spoken about the back end. One of the very interesting features of Russian offers is the take-back policy, which is a huge thing because not many countries know how to deal with the back end of the fuel cycle. So what would be the solution which any Western offer provide in order to be able to compensate for the fact that in order to be able to meet any Russian offer regarding this take-back policy?
Okay. I was put this into two. Who wants to take the China and who wants to take the Russia on our panel?
All right, I would just say, I don't think the Chinese signed the 3-time pledge, but it may include, it wasn't specific to a country, it was specific to the globe. So it's conceivable that it could include them. On the sidelining of Russia, one thing I didn't say that I want to underscore here is I think we need to start putting a political and financial price on energy security and global security and geopolitical influence that offsets what is a very large cost of the reactor. And I think that's something that not just the United States government, but the political environment of the United States needs to somehow grapple with.
Other comments, Steve? So I'll just comment on the Russia. I think you put your finger on a serious issue because, I mean, you're absolutely right. This is a huge advantage Russia has in any negotiation with a potential partner that they would take back the spent fuel. And this is one of those issues, I'll analogize it to Yucca Mountain, where, Yucca Mountain, look, it is obvious that our policy of leaving spent nuclear fuel all over the country in small quantities, near population centers, is crazy and vastly inferior to a policy of consolidating that fuel somewhere where it can be safely stored. But I can castigate our political system, but look, we've demonstrated we're incapable politically of solving the problem. I'd say that taking back spent nuclear fuel is sort of a similar issue where it's we don't want anybody to reprocess nuclear fuel because that's a shortcut to having a nuclear weapon. So why would we want to leave spent nuclear fuel countries all over the world? Wouldn't we want to take that back from a non-proliferation point of view? Absolutely. Get it away from where it could be reprocessed. Will our politics permit us to bring all this nuclear fuel back to the United States? For the same reasons we can't reach agreement on where to put our own spent nuclear fuel. I mean, there's your threshold problem. You're going to bring it back. Where are you going to put it? I don't have a solution to that. I wish rationally our country should come up with one, but we've been incapable of doing so.
I don't have a solution either, but I guess the first thing I would suggest thinking about is, let's get together a group of our closest allies and partners on nuclear matters and see if there are one or more of them who might be interested in doing that, and see if we can build some kind of a consortium type approach where that would be kind of part of a package that we would put together as a group. That's all I got. That's all I got.
Thinking about the topic, and then 4 data points just to ask the ultimate question. In November, the U.S. sponsored the U.S. Nuclear Energy Summit U.S. Africa Nuclear Energy Summit in Ghana. The chair of Exim was on a panel, and at the time and still currently, Exim is barred from doing work in Ghana. Czech Republic, Westinghouse, and Bechtel were in the final 3. They got tossed. Bulgaria picked an AP1000, but Bechtel was in the set of contractors that was being considered. They didn't make the cut. Interestingly, a Korean contractor did. Can you mention the attendance at Atom Expo this year that was at an all-time high? When you take those 4 data points together, what does it tell you?
It tells me that we have an enormous amount of work to do on that side of the ledger that needs to match what we've done on the climate side of the ledger. I mean, the climate side of the ledger is stunning to me, okay? I mean, really dramatically stunning to me. And that wasn't a given, right? I mean, if you talk to anybody, you're as knowledgeable as anybody. 5 years ago, it was an uphill battle. And so I say 5 years from now, that's what I would like on energy security and geopolitics for us to have done exactly what we did on the climate side. Not to ignore the climate side, but to pocket it and continue it and then work on this side of it. But it's going to be much more expensive to do this and painful, I think, to do this because you're competing with your friends to do it.
Okay, we got 5 minutes and I think 2 questions. So Seth and then the gentleman in the back, and maybe we'll take them together and then wrap.
Yeah, I was at the summit in Brussels. The banker who made the comment was Ernie Moniz. And other people on the panel included a finance minister, some former bankers. It was not the most accurate Bloomberg article ever. And Ari didn't write it. But picking up on the point, though, which was a valid point they were making, one of the issues is, as Paul raised, barriers to foreign investment in U.S. nuclear. And these go to licensing, these go to CFIUS, these go to, imputed Party 10 issues if someone's on your board, et cetera. And when you have people from Canada, from the UK, from some of our closest allies, have such a hard problem investing in U.S. nuclear, that I think part of the way to meet the COP28 triple nuclear pledge of increasing cooperation among signatories is really take a serious look at these barriers and start knocking them down if they don't really affect U.S. national security. And I'd be interested in ideas on how to do that, and I would suggest that really be an important thing because where a lot of companies go to DOE who won't have to if foreign investors were filling that void.
Okay, last question.
Yeah, quickly, the Atomic Enhancement Act that passed the House, obviously still sitting with the Senate just in the last month or so. There's a piece of that that gives DOE authority to enter into long-term power purchase agreements with nuclear projects. I'm curious thoughts on the attractiveness as an option to sort of bridge this commercialization gap, the chicken and egg problem. We need enough reactors to justify the investment in the field processing. These sorts of questions. Could we use power purchase agreements as a way to, maybe by DOE or someone, to get us over this gap?
We have 1 minute comment from each of our commenters.
I'm conceptually supportive of that, I would say. Yeah.
Oh, good. That was succinct.
That's
Steve,
my
that's setting a good
very
example. All right, we'll reverse the order. So Steve, you get the the penultimate last word, and then Ken. On answer to the last couple of comments and questions.
I actually defer to others.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Well, the
I
gentleman
mean, I'm
reserved.
very supportive.
The gentleman
of
reserved.
all
What is
that
happening
we're
here?
doing, but
I yield back to Dr.
Okay.
Luongo.
I can't comment on power purchase agreements because I don't know enough about them. But I think, Seth, to your point, what is in the U.S. national security interest in the 21st century is the question that we should be asking and trying to answer. I mean, I think the thing that Paul did in this report, and I have to say, so much stuff comes across your desk, blah, blah, blah. But this concept of an archaeological accumulation of law and policy that never gets unearthed and revisited it's not productive for the environment that we're in now, which is rapid paced and extremely challenging. So I think revisiting what is in the U.S. national security interest, and I would even say, thinking about spent fuel and how you would treat it, is something that should be in the discussion.
I would just, in the 14 seconds remaining, and going back to Paul's earlier thing, I'll just cite, I don't know if it was Chatham House, but a major Senate committee chair who said that they took great pride in discovering that with semiconductors, there was a national security imperative, a broken domestic supply chain, and adversaries moving in at our expense. And looked around and say, where else is that happening? And guess what they found? They found us. $52 billion. And, you know, Katie, God bless her, she's scrambling in there, and they had 2.72. It's better than a sharp stick in the eye, to be sure. But these other countries are stroking phenomenal checks. I won't even get into it. And I think everyone knows what I'm talking about. So, you know, we've got to step up. You know, Bernie Moniz also said, no exports, no influence. And I think Steve said, and Katie too, we need to be strong domestically. Enough of the finger wagging. Nobody's going to listen to our finger wagging anymore. This is game, set, match. That was clear since April 7th, 1977, when Jimmy Carter couldn't even get our good friends in Japan to back off of reprocessing. So, you know, I think we need what we call reality therapy. I think this is a phenomenal report, a lot of food for thought. I hope, Paul, this is only the beginning of the conversation. There's way too much good stuff and content to just let one session be it, but I think lots of conversation with Florida's. I could not be more grateful to you for having written it, for having invited me to be part of this great thing in the Center for National Interest and the Energy Innovation Reform Project. I want to thank our incredibly talented and august audience for participating in questions. And stay safe and have a great day. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.